drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a Ph.D. in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Who you are and what you do?
Yes, so my name is Maxime Aubert. So I'm a professor at Griffiths University in Australia on the Gold Coast. I'm an archaeologist, but I'm a geochemist also. So I did undergrad in archaeology and anthropology, and then I did a master's and a PhD in geochemistry. I do a lot of stuff about human evolution. So what I'm focusing on at the moment is dating things. So I've got a project dating cave paintings in Southeast Asia. So that's one of the things that I do at the moment. And I think that's why I'm here to talk about that.
Yeah, among other things, probably. But so you've done, so you're an archaeologist, but you have a geochemistry background. So you know a lot about how to date the rocks and the minerals and work with that physical material.
Yeah, exactly. So my first interest was like history and then archaeology. And then I started a degree on that, and I started a master's in archaeology. And then I had an opportunity in my life to came to Australia to work with someone, and then I realized I needed to do more science. So I changed my master's in archaeology to a master's of science, so in geochemistry. And then after that, I did a PhD on that. But I had an idea that I thought we could do to date cave paintings. So to do that, I mean, no one was doing that really at the time. And the reason was that the machines that was needed to do the kind of dating that I wanted to do, which is it's called uranium series dating. You needed quite big samples, and it was a prototype of a machine that was developed in Germany, but the prototype was in Australia at the Research School of Earth Sciences at the Australian National University. So I invited myself there, and then I essentially did my PhD there. I was enrolled in Canada, but I spent 90% of my time there. In the lab, then I learned a lot how to use this machine and how to do, like what I wanted to do. And then before I left there, before I finished my PhD, they offered me a job. So I didn't came to here, like in Australia, to stay. I just came to study, and then they offered me a job, and then I got married and got kids, and then 20 years later, I'm still here.
So, yeah, before we get to some of your research in detail, can you just give us like a basic sense, like a basic survey of some of the most famous cave paintings in the world in terms of where they're located, if they're concentrated in certain regions, and how old they are? Like the one that I've heard of, that I've always known about, that I think a lot of people probably see is the Chauvet cave paintings.
Yeah, so Chauvet Cave, so it's in France. So there's a lot of cave paintings and cave art in Western Europe. They're mainly located in southwest of France and Spain also, like mainly northern Spain. So the cave is usually really deep inside caves, and it's usually, not always, but it's usually made of black charcoal. So it's either drawing or paintings made of black charcoal. The oldest one there, and probably one of the most famous, is Chauvet Cave. But that was only discovered in the 90s, I think. But prior to that, there was a Lascaux Cave and there's Altamira in Spain. So they're really, especially Chauvet Cave is very spectacular. You have like large mammals like lions in like movements and rhinoceros and then so there's a lot of animals that don't exist in Europe today. So But when that cave was first discovered, people thought it was relatively young because of the sophistication of the paintings. Because there was an idea at the time that art starts simple, and then when it evolves with time, it gets more complicated. And now you had there like narrative scenes, and you had like animals depicted in movements, etc. So radiocarbon dating was performed, and then it was shown to be about 35 or 36,000 years old. I have some issues with the dating. I think they are probably quite old, but there are some issues with radiocarbon datings of paintings like that. Like Lascaux Cave, for example, is about 20,000. Altamira also 20,000. So the problem that I have with the dating when they do radiocarbon dating of pigments, because they can date the pigment themselves because it's made of like fossilized wood, for example, is that it doesn't date really when the painting or the like drawing was done. It dates when the wood, when the tree from the wood died. So if essentially I walk into Chauvet Cave today, and then I pick up a 40,000-year-old piece of charcoal on the cave floor and I write my name with it on the cave wall, it's going to date 40,000 years, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't date when someone used it to make a painting, right? So that's the problem that I have with it. So it provides essentially a maximum age.
Yeah, but most of the paintings are probably somewhat younger than that.
Yeah, exactly. So, but they don't say that. So they say, oh, the painting is that old, which maybe, but maybe not. So there's a lot of animals that are still like that are depicted and that don't exist in Europe now today. So it's probably an indication that it's pretty old. There's a cave also in southern France near Marseille, which is actually underwater now. Like the entry is underwater because the like sea level rose. So we know that so it's probably about 20,000 years old, because 20,000 years ago the sea level was much lower and people could get in the cave and then made the paintings and the drawing in there. So we know it's old. There's been some study on Chauvet also where like the cave entrance had collapsed and all sorts of things like that they're trying to show that yes, it is really, really that old. But yeah, I just wish that they would express really that the dating of the pigment itself is actually only maximum ages.
And so you said that there's a lot of cave paintings in Western Europe and places in France and Spain, for example. Is that because humans were making cave paintings in that region more than they were making them elsewhere? Or is it because the geology of the region is more conducive to preserving the artwork?
Well, so we don't know really. So that's the thing. So usually the paintings are usually done in limestone caves, usually deep inside the cave. It's cold also, so maybe it preserves them better. But before we started doing the dating of the rock art in Sulawesi and Borneo, not everybody believed that, but there was some sort of an idea in the field which was very Eurocentric, that it's just when modern humans reached Western Europe that they became modern, that their mind developed enough that they became really, really modern. So it was really a Eurocentric view of the world because most of the research was done there, and people have been said that for centuries. And now, like, it's part of sort of the cultural identity of some culture. Like in France, for example, they learn in school that, it's part of their culture, and they invented, like rock art and things like that. And then when we started dating rock art in Sulawesi and Borneo, we showed that no, actually there's rock art there also that's as old as the rock art in Western Europe. And when we're pushing the dates now, it's even older. So it's either that rock art was invented at different places at different times or at the same time, or that rock art really is everywhere, but it's just like it's preserved in certain places. Or also there could be, so I believe probably that when modern humans left Africa, probably 100,000 years ago, they had the capacity really to make rock art like anything they wanted. It's just when you arrive at certain places and where your society reaches a certain point, that's where you actually need them. So, like for like signaling system, for example, your population grows and you need to like identify to something. So then it becomes part of your culture. But before that, if you're just a small group of hunter-gatherer, maybe you don't need to do it,
Even though you have the capacity, you just don't have the social need for what it's doing functionally.
yeah, exactly. And like as an example, I'm just thinking. So when my daughter was born, my son was not even 2 years old, and I remember we were at the hospital, and then he put his hand on the window, and then he did this, like with his
Yeah.
breath, and then he did a handstand. So I've never showed him that before, and he said, "Oh, look, my hand." So you don't need anything special, really. Like
Mhm.
we know how to do this. We discover things. We just that's who we are as humans.
And so we're going to get to some of your research, which will take us to Southeast Asia, to some interesting places that you've been working on. But so you said when humans came, everyone sort of knows, I think, anyone who's listening to this probably, that at some point humans left Africa and we spread throughout the globe. Can you just give us
Yeah.
a basic sense of when do we know that humans first started leaving Africa, and approximately like when did they go west to Europe? When did they go east to Southeast Asia? Can you kind of paint a general picture there for us?
Yeah, well, until not too long ago, we thought that was so modern human evolved in Africa. We still think that, but the oldest evidence was Homo kibis, so that was from Ethiopia. That was dated to about 200,000 years ago. So
Mm-hmm.
I actually did the dating of that fossil itself.
Mm.
So that was dated to at least
Mm-hmm.
200,000.
And so that's it, that
So
200,000 number. Is that sort of the number that's what we roughly consider to be the age of anatomically modern humans?
yeah. So that's like us, like anatomically modern human.
Mm-hmm.
And then recently there was a paper that was published where there's an older one. So there's actually a skull also. So that was found in Morocco at Jebel Houd, and that was dated to 300,000. But there's argument that it's not fully modern human. So there's things in the skull, for example, that doesn't fit really like what we are today. So the interpretation is that it's probably modern human, but it suggests that there may have been different subspecies of modern human living at that time. And it's not until 200,000 years ago that really we all came together and it became really like fully modern human. And then at some stage, a group of modern human left Africa for some reason. And we think that could have happened about 100,000 years ago. And it could have been fairly exodus. So we think that there could have been some modern human that left. They made it to like Israel, where Israel is today, Saudi Arabia. There was a really old specimen in China also, but that has been changed now because the dating wasn't done properly, or there was a bit of issues there. So there seemed to be probably an exodus out of Africa about 100,000 years ago, and that was failed. So the modern human didn't, like they probably got extinct or they came back to Africa. We don't know exactly what happened. But then, probably 75,000 years ago, a group of modern humans left Africa, and then they went everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So the dating, it's really difficult to pin that, but it's based on, for example, we know that modern human arrived in Australia about 65,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
There's also some dating based on the DNA, when they look at the DNA, but you can't really date with DNA. So you can date the mutation. And this is based, if I'm correctly, on mutations of chicken and stuff. So, so it's not really a dating method. But so, yeah. And then when modern human arrived in Europe also, we used to thought it was about 40,000 years ago. But now there's a new site that was discovered a couple of years ago. Now it's dated to 54,000 years ago now in Europe at a site in France. So yeah, so we know that modern human left Africa and they populated the world relatively quickly. And then it was thought that when they reach Western Europe, we thought at the time about 40,000 years ago that they start making cave art because we found a lot of it there, and also like jewelry, like tools, etc. And when they arrived there, they met another human species, the Neanderthals that lived there also. And there's also a controversy about where they're making art also. So that's also one of the big questions in archaeology. And then also, but we know that our species, modern human, we arrived in Asia and in Australia before we reached Europe. So because we know that modern human arrived in Australia 65,000 years ago, we know they were on mainland Asia about the same time, 75. There's a couple of sites. There's a site in Sumatra. There's another site in Laos. That's pretty old. But in between, because we know they had to come from come through a series of islands called Wallacea. So even when the sea level were lower, there was always islands there, like in Indonesia. But there's no archaeological sites that old there. The oldest thing that we have is the rock art. So we're using the rock art actually to date the movement of people. And now the oldest date that we have published so far, it's a paper we published in Nature a couple of weeks ago. We have a site that's dated to at least 51,200, but it's probably older than that. And we have more stuff coming out in the near future. I can't tell you more about it because it's not published, but yeah, but we're going to go much older than that.
Yeah. So roughly speaking, the timeline is you've got anatomically modern humans in Africa, and probably only in Africa, about 200,000 years ago. And then about 100,000 years ago, you've got some of the first attempts of those anatomically modern humans to leave Africa. And they do, but they don't stick. Something happens. Probably multiple waves of these anatomically modern people come out. But by the time you get to 75 to 50,000 years ago, people are now out of Africa. They're spreading into Asia, into Australia, eventually into Europe and the Americas. And the work, there's cave paintings in Europe, there's cave paintings elsewhere in Indonesia that we're going to talk about. But basically, we know that they were making cave paintings probably about by at least 50,000 years ago, and we'll go into some detail there. And I'm sort of getting the impression already that this is the type of thing where things kind of keep getting older and older as we discover more over time.
Yeah, exactly. So things get older as we discover more, but also we're developing new techniques also. So it's not just, so it's the method also that's improving. So I can talk about that a bit later. So I'll have to go through the method, how it works, et cetera, how we used to do it and how we do it now. But yeah, so the more we're exploring, we're finding more sites, the more dating we do, it gets older. But also it's interesting because and that's why I think it's probably has a much older it's probably much older because the oldest art that we have in Indonesia, so now I said like dating to at least 51.2, but it's essentially very complex art. It's not something simple. You've got like narrative scenes. So it's not just handstand seal, you got large animal paintings, you got there depicting human next to them. They're making actually a scene. All the three oldest ones in Sulawesi that we've dated, they actually scenes. So it's interesting because us as a species, we like to define ourselves as a species that likes to tell story. Well, this is the oldest evidence of storytelling is on the walls there in the caves in Southeast Asia. So it's a complicated thing. It's not really something simple. So to me, it makes me think that like probably when modern human left Africa 100,000 years ago, they were fully modern, so they could do that. So it's either that we haven't found it or they were not doing it until they reach certain places.
And so before we get to some of the methods that you've used, because I know that you're using methods that are probably weren't being used even a few years ago, but like when we think about Chauvet Cave, some of these more well-known cave paintings that have been known for many years, often what you hear about is radiocarbon dating. Was that historically what was used to date some of this stuff? And how does that actually work, the radiocarbon dating?
So what was done in the past, people still do that. So you do radiocarbon dating. So with that method, you can only date something that was alive before, like something that is organic. So in the case of most of the paintings in Western Europe, it's not all of them, but a lot of them they're made with charcoal, so black charcoal. So that's probably from a tree, that burned like at some stage in the past, and then you can date that with radiocarbon dating because so I don't know how much detail I can get into, but there's a few isotopes of carbon. There's carbon-14, carbon-13, and carbon-12. Carbon-14 is radioactive, so it disappears with time, and then we know at which rate it disappears. So it's produced in the high atmosphere. We at a constant rate. Well, it's not technically true, but we know like it's produced in the high atmosphere. So everything that's alive today will have a known ratios of carbon-14 to carbon-13 and carbon-12. And then when that thing died, so if it's a tree or a person or like an animal, when it died, it stops actually exchanging carbon with the air. So the carbon-14 disappears at a known rate. So if we go and take a sample today, then we know, okay, so there's only this tiny amount of of carbon-14 in it, and then we measure it compared to carbon-12 and carbon 13, and then we can calculate the age. So now, usually the limit is about 40,000, but then now, like, they're pushing it back to about 50,000 in the right circumstances. So after that, it's still decaying, but there's so little that you can't see it. You can't see it. Yeah. So you just need like maybe in the future with better machines, you'll be able to push it further back in time. But yeah, so that's essentially how it works. As I explained before, it doesn't date the painting event. So when someone did a painting, it dates when the tree that made the charcoal died. Right? So essentially, it provides a maximum age. So
radiocarbon dating there's a couple limitations here. One, you can only date the age of formerly living things, and you can sort of triangulate the age based on how carbon is cycling through organic material over time and when it died. But there's also this other limitation of, as you mentioned, if you date the material the art was made with, it's the age of how old the material is. It's not when it was used to actually make the art.
Exactly.
And so how do you walk us through some of the more modern, sophisticated techniques that you've been using and how they work in comparison to something like radiocarbon dating?
Yeah, well, maybe I'd like before to explain why I think rock art is really important. It's fascinating. It's because, so what we know about our past, like our really long distance past, it's only based on really on a handful of sites of like archaeological sites. So people go and dig, they spend like thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to digging sites. And what you actually found is the trash of people, like people eat stuff or whatever, and they lift the desk. So you have really a narrow window of the past. But there's a lot more rock art sites in the world. There's a lot more, like millions. The problem is that it's really hard to date, so you don't know how old it is, so you can't really use it. And that's why I was always fascinated by that. He said, is there a way that we can date it? So then I learned about the radiocarbon dating technique, and then I saw the limitation of that, and then I thought, okay, so a lot of this rock art is in limestone caves. And then in limestone caves, you have also like stalactite and stalagmite, like that forms in the caves. And I saw the photos, and I remember from a book, and there was flowstone that had formed on top of a bison in France in one of the caves. And I said, surely we can date that. And we can. So large speleothem like stalactite and stalagmite so they've been dated before with the uranium series dating method. So the way that it works essentially is that so water, like rainwater, seeps through the limestone, and then it dissolves a small amount of calcium, and at the same time it picks up uranium. Also like small amounts of uranium, because uranium is water soluble and uranium is radioactive. So then it will actually form, so water will drip at the surface of the cave wall. And if there's a painting there also, it's fine. So it will drip on top of it, and then it will reprecipitate at the surface, and it will form layers, like thousands of layers on top of it. And they will have small amounts of actually uranium in it.
And that's just natural. The uranium is just naturally present in the earth?
Exactly. So it's only a small amount, but it's everywhere. So there's small amounts of uranium in the limestone itself, and then it's picked up by the water, and then the calcium reprecipitate at the surface, and then it got uranium in it. And uranium is radioactive, and it will decay to like a few things, but one of the things that it decays to is thorium-230. And thorium is not soluble in water. So essentially at time zero, when those film of calcite that are forming on top of a painting, there will be uranium in it, but no thorium. And the decay rate of uranium into thorium is precisely known. So when we go and get a sample and we bring it back into the lab, we measure the ratio of uranium and thorium in the sample, and then we can calculate back when those film precipitated over the painting. So in that case, we can have a minimum age for the painting, and sometimes there's some films that were there before, so we can have a maximum age. Sometimes we can have both. So we can bracket the paintings that it was made between 40 and 45,000.
So similar principle to radiocarbon dating. You're looking at the ratio of, radiocarbon dating. It's two different isotopes of carbon, and with this, it's the ratio of uranium to the other element.
Yeah, exactly. The difference is that so the radiocarbon works with living things, and also you're measuring essentially the radiocarbon, so the carbon 14 that is disappearing with time. With the uranium series method, you're essentially measuring the thorium-230 that's building up with time. So the older your sample are, actually you get like it's actually better. So you can get so the limit it's about 600,000 that you can go. But so the more thorium-230 you have in your sample, the more clear it is. Like the more actually you can get a better date. So it's true that we can date really, really young stuff now, but yeah, like at the time, so at the time when I started, well, when I wanted to do that, the limitation, so this was applied to like speleothems, so large stalagmite and stalagmite in caves, and that was used to reconstruct the climate in the past. Because so those stalactite and stalagmite, they precipitate from water, and you can actually get information from the water about past climate. And with the carbon also, so you can look at the vegetation that was there in the past, etc. So, and if you can date those layers, well, then you can go back in time and say, okay, 10,000, 12,000 years ago, there was something happened, the earth got warmer or colder, etc. You couldn't use that to date rock art because the sample needed for the machines were too big. So, you can't go on top of of like a precious rock art and say, okay, there's calcite on top of it. I'm just going to cut a big piece of it and take it to the lab and date it. So so it's not until the new mass spectrometry, so the multi-collector ICP-MS came about that now they use like a plasma source, and then you can use much, much, much smaller samples. So that's where I came in and said, okay, so we can use this machine to actually date very small samples, like we're talking like extremely, extremely small. And so the damage to the rock art is really negative. So it doesn't make like big holes in the rock wall.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, so over time, you guys can do dating with very small samples compared to what you used to. So there's less concern about actually disrupting the cave art itself.
Yeah, exactly. So and even now we have another way of doing it. So which is even smaller. So before, what we used to do is we used to go in the field and we cut. So most of the time, what's forming on top of the rock art, essentially in Sulawesi, in Borneo, there was more flowstone, but in Sulawesi, there's called cave popcorn. So it's like small aggregate that starts forming like little bits there and then a little bit there, and then they join together, and it looks like a popcorn. And then we used to take the whole popcorn out. So usually they're about 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, sometimes smaller. And then in the lab, I cut it in half so then we can see the pigment layer going through it. And so you're like 100% that everything that's above it, it's going to give you a minimum age. And then after that, you need to, so I was using like a dentist tool with like a rotary tool, and I was essentially doing a micro excavation. So I had to divide the calcite layer because it's thousands of layers. And because there's some potential issues with uranium series dating, is the main thing is you need to show that you have a closed system, that uranium hasn't leached out or came in later. So if uranium has leached out, well, then your sample is going to get too old because you're measuring the ratio of uranium versus thorium. So if your inbuilt thorium is the same, right, but uranium has leached out, when you calculate your age, it's going to be too old. So you need to show that you have a closed system. And the way we were doing this is we were doing at least 3 subsamples. So as I said, there's thousands of layers, but with like a little drill, we do excavation. We start from the surface and we divide it into 3 or 4 or 5 subsamples, and then we have to show that they in like chronological order. So they're younger at the surface and they get older towards the pigment layer. Because the idea was that if uranium had leached out, you would have actually a reverse stage profile. So they will get older towards the surface, and that never happened. So we never really saw that. But so that's what we were doing. but there was some criticism of that. People saying you cannot be sure that you don't have any leaching in small samples like this, and it only works on big speleothem, etc. And even if you do that, you're never sure that the first layer that's closest to the pigment layer doesn't have any leaching in it. So I had an idea of doing something instead. We've developed this to date, actually bones. I can go into that in details, but we're using laser ablation. So instead, and that's what the new paper that we published in Nature a couple of weeks ago, we had a really old site, but also we're using a new method. So we still get a sample in the field, but we don't need a sample as big. So we're using a little core now, like a 5 millimeter core. We drill that, so it makes really small hole. And then after that, we cut the core in half, and then we map it with a laser ablation system. So we actually map all of the U series isotopes. So we're measuring uranium-238, 234, thorium-230, 232, etc. And we're actually having an isotope map distribution of your samples, and then you can see what's going on. And then you can see that if there's any leaching of a uranium, you'll see it. And sometimes we can actually see it on two samples. We can see it in small places. But the beauty of it is that after you have all of the data, so you have your map, you can calculate ages wherever you want after that on the map. So the data is there, and you can go back as many times as you want. So we can identify, okay, so there's a little area of leaching here. We don't want to date from that. So we're going to calculate a date from here, the closest to the pigment layer as possible. Then it's going to give you like the oldest minimum age, and then you can get like ages above, wherever you want. You can calculate ages. And that's the beauty of it. And that's faster, that's cheaper, and the resolution is better because we're using a 50 micron spot size, so you can get closer to the pigment layer. So because we're not dating the pigment, so we're dating what has formed above it. So the closer you can get, the older your age will be. So, and that's what we are doing now, and we're not going to go back to the previous method with the solution because, well, I call it solution, but it's a lot of work. You need to micro excavate the powder. Then there's a lot of chemistry involved, and it takes a lot of time. And it's not as good as the laser.
Yeah. So in essence, using this new dating method, this newer technology, you're not dating the pigment of the cave art itself. You're taking samples of the geology that's sort of formed layer by layer on top of the actual art. It's more sophisticated, it's more sensitive, so you can date things with more precision. You can go back further in time. And you mentioned Sulawesi, the site where you guys were excavating. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? So let's just start. Where is this, and how did you actually start looking there? Why did you look in this place and not some other place?
Yeah, well, we didn't excavate the sites where we dated rock art. Like my colleague Adam Brum is excavating on sites there, but there is rock art there, but we don't have dates on the oldest paintings. But yeah, it started there. I started to work there because so I don't know how much of the story you want, but at the time I was in Australia. I was in the Australian National University, and then I finished my PhD. They offered me a postdoc, and then I applied for. In Australia, you can apply for funding it's called the Australian Research Council. And I applied for a fellowship, which I got, and it was for 3 years. And I decided to move it to a different university. It was University of Wollongong. And then when I got there, then I was sharing an office with Adam Brum, who was working in Sulawesi doing digs there, like excavations. And in the excavations that he was doing there, he was finding a lot of ochre, like in really old layers. But he didn't know if it related to the rock art. But there's a lot of rock art there, and it's been known for a long time. But most of the people thought that the rock art was relatively recent. They thought that it was dated to the Austronesian period. So Austronesian is the first farmers that arrived there. We think they arrived from probably Taiwan, maybe 4,000 years ago, and they introduced rice and farming and etc. So people in general thought that the paintings there dated to that time. And then one time Adam went to a rock art site on a Sunday or something, and then he was looking up, and then there's lots of handstand sills, and then he saw those small nodules on top of it. And then when he came back to the office, he showed it to me, and I said, "Yeah, they're like cave popcorn. I'm pretty sure we can date those." And then a long story. We asked for funding from the university. They didn't want to help us. So I said, we were broke. So we just paid. I paid myself tickets, went there. I went at the back of at the back of a motorbike, going around and looking at caves, and took some samples, and then brought them back to the lab. And then I was like, what? Like, it was like 40,000 years old. So yeah, so that was a big shock and a big discovery at the time.
So you didn't necessarily expect this ahead of time. You didn't have reason to think it would be this old. It just happened that way.
Yeah, it just happened that way, and then we dated that more. One, like, we had, like, at the time we didn't have any sample over like animal. There was only hand stencil, and we dated. I think there was 3 or 4 hand stencil, and we had multiple dates, because we're doing all those sub layers, and then something very frustrating happened is that we wrote a paper, we sent it to the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. We said, surely that's going to get in. And then it was rejected. And then the reason why it was rejected was even more frustrating. It was because the reviewers, because when you write a scientific papers, it goes for peer review and stuff. So the peer review got back and they said they didn't have any issues with the dating, but essentially it was too controversial, the result, because it essentially unseated Europe as the bird of art, that They said that they wanted more. But I've seen a lot of papers in those journal with less evidence than that. So then, and remember, we were broke. So then people were said, "Oh, what do we do? So do we just submit it to like a different journal, which is less impact factor and etc." But at the time, we were really young in our career, so a paper in the top scientific journal in the world will help your career a lot. So we said, okay, we'll just bite and then we went back the next year. We got more samples. We got like an animal as well. So essentially figurative art. We got more and stencil, and then we changed the paper. We sent it again. We did because when you submit a paper, you need to write a letter to the editor. We did a better letter explaining why this is important, and then it got accepted, and then it got published, and it was put on the front cover of Nature. And then that it was in 2014, so 10 years ago. And also, so there's Nature and there's Science. It's the 2 biggest multidisciplinary journals in the world. And Science, every year they have a top 10 scientific breakthrough of the year. So they picked that up in the top 10 scientific breakthrough of the year. So then we went on from there, and then we made that list another time also a couple of years later.
So these cave paintings that you're talking about, how old are the older ones, and what are they actually painting? What were the humans interested in depicting?
Yes, so the oldest one we've got so far, so that's the one we published a few weeks ago. It's so the minimum age, because we're dating the calcite on top of it, is 51,200. So it's a site called Liang Karampuang. So it's in southwest Sulawesi. So Sulawesi, it's an island in Indonesia. So it's immediately, yeah. So, okay, you're sharing it on the screen. So yes, so that's that one there. So essentially a depiction of a pig, and there's at least 3 human figures next to it.
I see. So the pig is this structure here.
Yeah.
And then these smaller figures next to it are supposed to be human depictions?
Yeah, there's 3 human figures. So this is a drawing of it, because it's hard to see. The problem is that when it's the rock out there, the preservation is not very good, because it's very old, and it's mostly preserved at the entrance of the cave, unlike in Europe when it's deep inside the cave. I think I'm not sure if it's because people just painted it at the entrance. I don't think so, but essentially the surface of the cave wall is peeling away. We're not so sure what happened. We think there's salts forming behind the surface. So anyway, the rock art is disappearing, like with time. And the more deep you go inside the cave, you can see that the wall, like the old surface of the cave walls are gone. It's the newer surface, the fresher surface. And I remember one time I was walking in a cave really deep. You can see, okay, this is all the new fresh surface. And then you can see a little bit of the old surface, and you can see bits of fingers there. So you mean, okay, so this whole thing was painted. But what we see today, is 1% or less than 1%. So yeah, so it's difficult to see because of the essentially it's flaking off, but also the ones that we can date, they're the ones that have the calcium carbonate formation on top of them. So it's make them even harder to see.
Hmm.
So this pig there, like, is covered with those cave popcorn.
Hmm.
But
How do
when
you
you look in details, you can see them.
Yeah. And when you discover these initially, how do you find them? Are you just looking with the naked eye and you guys are just really good at picking the stuff up, or do you have to use some kind of scanner or something to sort of to actually see that something is there?
No, well, I didn't discover that site, but there's a whole team, right? So it's not me. So there's a whole team, and there's a whole team of local people also, from the local office of the preservation office, and there's an archaeology office also local there. And every year, they go and survey and stuff, and they find like dozens of those sites every year,
Hmm.
dozens.
Hmm.
And then when they have some good ones and stuff, now I've trained some people how to recognize some with samples on it for dating and stuff, and then I go back after. Then I say, oh, okay, yes, that's a good one for to take a sample, and then we
Hmm.
take a sample and we date it. So our team, we have discovered also new sites, but we also work a lot with the local groups
Hmm.
there.
And so this image here, from the recent Nature paper. So it's a pig with three humans. It's at
Yeah.
least 51,000 years old. Can you tell what the scene is supposed to be showing here? Like, are these human hunters that are hunting the pig? What's the story being told here? Do we know?
We don't know really. Like, the preservation is pretty bad, so we don't really know. They seem to have objects in their hands.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
and one is making contact
Yep.
with the pig.
A
So we
good
think
guess
really
is it could be a hunting scene, and those could be spears or
they
something.
they could be, so, but we don't know. But there's another one that's it's in the same paper, but we redated.
Hmm.
So there's a site called Bulusipong 4. So I think it's going to be above that. And that's a site which, because clearly you can see it's a scene or
Mm.
like a hunting scene, that one here. And then you have multiple uh, animals there. So there's pig and there's an oa. So I don't know if you can see on the left-hand side, there's a human we call a therianthrope, because they're not fully human. So I can come into that
Yeah.
in a minute. But that one looks like to have a spear or a rope in its hand,
Yeah.
and it's got a tail. So
Huh.
so there's a tail, and then you have lots of pigs and an anoa, and completely on the right hand side you have an anoa. Well, there's two. There's a head and there's a full anoa. Next to it on the left, there's a series of small figures. They all have some rope or spear, and they have like animal attributes. So once they got like birds
Hmm.
head
Hmm. Hmm.
or something like that, which is quite interesting because we published that site for the first time a couple of years ago, also in Nature, and that was also picked up by Science as the top 10 scientific discovery of the year. And we dated that scene at the time at least 44,000. We redated it with the new laser method to 48,000
Hmm.
at least, so it's minimum 48,000. But at the time, it was the first really scene that we saw in the rock arts. The first time I saw like anything like that. So it's then at the time we said, well, it suggests that, yeah, like human at the time were not just making stencils and
Yeah.
figurative art, they were making complex
Yeah.
art, they were
Yeah.
making
They're not just tracing their
scenes.
hands or writing, simple
Exactly.
shapes. It's
So
telling a story of some kind.
it's a story. So that's the first evidence of storytelling.
Hmm.
But what's also interesting is that they're depicting not quite humans, but like what we call therianthropes. So they're half human, half animals,
Yeah.
and that's a concept in archaeology. The oldest one that's known in archaeology prior to that was the Lion Man, a carving from Germany, dated to about
Yeah. Yeah.
40,000. So
And this is pretty
so it,
common, right? These therianthropes, these human animal hybrids in cave art.
Yeah, yeah, but the thing is, in Europe, it doesn't. I may be wrong, and there could be some like small examples that are older, but usually it starts appearing at about 20,000
Hmm.
years ago. So in Southeast Asia, like in Sulawesi, it's much, much, much older. And it's interesting because so before, when we dated instant okay, so they're making paintings, that old, and then after that you got large animal. Okay, so they're making figurative art, and then they're making a scene. But now they're depicting something that doesn't exist, right?
Right. Right.
So then it gives us essentially a view into their mind. So at the time, they were capable of conceiving of things that don't exist. So that's the birth of a spirituality, of religion, etc.
Yeah.
It starts
Yeah.
from
They're able to
from
imagine
that.
things that aren't there in front of their senses,
Yeah.
or
And that's
perhaps
what,
come to them from their dreams or something like that.
yeah, exactly. And that's what rock art and rock art dating like enables us to do. Like we can't go in the brains of the people in the past, but we can look at the pictures that they produce.
And so let's deconstruct this scene a little bit. So we've got hand stencils. People were tracing their hands. We've got these therianthropes, which are human animal hybrids. They look human-like, but they've got some animal characteristics. Most of them are holding something. Is it a rope? Is it a spear? We can't say. You've got the pig here, which they may be hunting, but again, we can't say. You've got more of these human figures, and then you've got anoas. Those look like antelope of some kind.
Yeah, it's a type of dwarf bovid, so and that's endemic there, like to Sulawesi. It's found nowhere else on the planet.
And so so people are doing this, 50,000 years ago. They're telling a story, right? So they're not just hand stencils, they're not just abstract shapes. There's some kind of narration happening here. And what's the significance of that in terms of how old this narrative capability is and what it might tell us about some of the other cognitive capabilities that people had at this time in this place?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's telling us essentially that humans have been telling stories for a very long time, and like we, as I said before, we like to define ourselves as a species that like to tell stories. Like, how are we different to other species? Well, yeah, that's probably it. Like we tell stories, and that's the oldest evidence of that. But it probably goes back much further than that in time. But the oldest evidence of us as a storytelling species is those cave paintings in Sulawesi, so dating now to at least 52,000 years ago.
And
So yep.
So in these caves, do you find any other artifacts like tools or other human artifacts that indicate, advanced behaviors that were happening?
Not in those caves. So because we haven't done any excavations in those caves, but they also so those two caves, so for example, like Liang Karampuang, that's the one at 51.2, and that one there, Belusi.4 at 48,000 minimum. They're not on the floor, like on the valley floor. They're up on the cliff face. So essentially, there's caves everywhere there, but but this is above, so you need to climb up to go up there. So that one you need actually they made like local people like a really tall ladder with bamboo and stuff, and you need to climb up. You have to climb up a hole to get in that cave, and it's a pretty small cave. There's no soil in there anyway. That's the same thing with Karampuang. You need to climb up with like climbing gear to get in there. So there's not really caves to do excavations, but my colleague Adam Brum is excavating another site there that it's got some stuff published from there, and they found, so it's in the same region. There's old hand stencil also like at the entrance, and he's doing an excavation at the entrance. And they found some like portable art also, some probably pieces of necklace and jewelry and stuff. So it's not just the rock art. People were also making other types of art, but it's very hard to find because the rock art is everywhere. But if you want to do an excavation and go that deep, then it's a lot of logistics, it's a lot of money, and not many people are doing that in that part of the world compared to what's being done and what's being done now in Western Europe. So you have lots of teams that have worked there before, so they found tons of jewelry and portable art, etc. But we just need more time and more people and people doing more excavation in those regions, and I'm sure we'll just find more.
Yeah. So it sounds like one of the things that you've mentioned is that there's many more known sites with cave art than there are sites where we've actually done the dating. So
yeah.
People find this art all over the place, but we only have studied in detail like this a small percentage of it.
Yeah, so in order to date it, there need to be some sort of like of the calcite formation that's formed on top of some of them.
Mm,
And that's quite rare. So we can
I
only
see.
date a few of them. But also, like as I said, like the local people there, they found dozens of those caves everywhere. And every time I bring people there, I just came back doing a movie there, and it's just people saying it's just everywhere. And I said, yeah. And that's the thing that I try to explain to people. Like, imagine if in Europe they would find another cave next to Chauvet, like Chauvet, it would be a huge discovery, right? Well, we're finding dozens of those every single year, like in Sulawesi, in that little part of Sulawesi. There are like hundreds of sites now, like 300 or 400
Hmm.
known sites.
Yeah. So it seems like this was a phenomenon. It wasn't a rare phenomenon where, a special artist person made one painting in this cave over here. It looks like they were kind of painting everywhere they could.
Well, yeah, it's not in every cave, but yeah, a
But it's
lot of the
quite common.
caves that they have, it's quite common, but in that small part. So it's like the southwest of Sulawesi.
Hmm.
We've worked on so in Borneo before. So Borneo is just across. So you got the Makassar Strait between Borneo and Sulawesi. So Sulawesi was always an island. Sea level were always an island. And a lot of the like animal species are endemics and all that sort of stuff. But we also have sites in Borneo on the eastern tip of Borneo. And that's when the sea level was lower, was not an island. So you can walk all the way through there. So there was paintings that had been discovered by those French people working there, Indonesian colleague now, Pindi Setiawan, who's passed away. And then they discovered a lot of the paintings there. They were doing excavation, but just really shallow, like at the surface. So when we got the dates for the rock art in Sulawesi, before the paper was published, I contacted Pindi Setiawan, who was the Indonesian archaeologist working there. And then we organized an expedition to go there. And then I collected some samples for dating, and we got some really old dates for rock art there, like dating back to at least 40,000 as well. Large animal, also like a bovid, and stencils also. But what was interesting also there is we managed to get a few of maximum ages also, because as I explained, we can date the calcium carbonate that's fallen on top. But sometimes most of the time they paint it straight on the rock wall,
Hmm.
but sometimes there was also calcium carbonate on top of the rock wall, and then they put a hand or they draw
Hmm.
something. And in Borneo, there, when we look at all of the rock art, there seem to be at least two different style of rock art. So one is large animal paintings and hand stencil in red,
Hmm.
and then you have hand stencil also in purple, and human figure in like purple. And sometimes these hand stencil they decorated them from the inside, look like tattoos and stuff. And then when they're at the same place, they're always superimposed on top of each other. So it's the red one first and the purple on top.
Hmm.
So we said, okay, so there's some sort of a pattern here going on. And when we did the dating, we realized that yes, there's actually two different phases. There's the red phase. It's at least 40,000. It could be much older than that. And then it stops at about 20,000 years ago, like the last glacial maximum. And then the new rock art phase, like the younger one, the purple one, starts at the last glacial maximum. So, which is quite interesting. So it's different, a team, they're depicting humans in the rock art, they're decorating their hands, and it's happening 20,000 years ago. And 20,000 years ago, it's the last glacial maximum. And you can see changes in the rock art in Europe also 20,000 years ago.
Hmm.
So, so there's like a global phenomenon that's affecting the rock
Yeah.
art worldwide, and that's the climate. And it brings me to the theory, like why were people doing rock art, and how did they develop this, and why
Yeah.
did they
Yeah.
do this? You never really know, because the only way is to have a time machine and go and ask them.
Hmm.
But so you can only speculate. But when you look at evidence, you can say, oh, okay, so maybe it's linked to like population. So essentially, like at the last glacial maximum, the sea level were much lower. So there was probably more people moving around, different groups, etc. So there's new people moving, or
Yep.
the groups get bigger,
Hmm.
etc. And I think that rock art really has to do something with large groups of humans. Like it's like
Hmm.
if you live in a small village today, you don't need like traffic lights. But if you go in a city, then you need traffic lights and you
Hmm.
need signal. Same thing also, like you need to identify to something. So now, like these days, is pop artists like Taylor Swift, for example, and you said, oh, okay, oh yeah, I know her, and so you're part of that group, right? Because you know her,
Yeah.
and it could have been the same for rock art. Oh, there's this site there on top of that hill there. Oh yeah, I know that. I've been there. So you're part of that. You're part of that identity. You're part of that group. So it could be linked to that, but it's also interesting that the rock arts in Western Europe, in Borneo, they are essentially at bottleneck, like places. So when modern human left Africa, and then so after that they either turn east or they turn west. When they arrive in Western Europe, there's nowhere else to go. When they arrive at the tip of Borneo, there's nowhere else to go. If you want to go to Sulawesi, you need a boat.
Yeah.
Right? So maybe population increases at that time at those places.
Because people settle there, they stop moving, they've reached the end of the line, basically.
They're stuck there for like a bit longer. So they need the population needs to increase. So then they develop boats and etc. But in Borneo, but also what's interesting is we did an excavation there at one of the sites, and we found the oldest burial in island Southeast Asia. So we found a 30 or 31,000, burial, so a modern human that's been buried. So on purpose, he was put in like a fetal position.
Is this in a cave?
In a cave with rock art. They put a big ball of ochre in his mouth. And what was really interesting is that so the left foot was missing from the grave, and we can see there was some modification to the bone. So there's something going on, and we thought looked like we're not expert. We said it looks like the foot has been amputated. Anyway, so that there was just before the COVID-19 pandemic, so we had to leave. We managed to have all of the bones and everything shipped to Australia, and then we had them analyzed by a specialist. And like the part of the leg and the foot had been amputated. So it was a young adult, but that leg had been amputated when it was a child. So that part of the leg didn't grow. So it's still like the children's leg. Oh. And then we can see the bone remodeling on top of where they cut.
I see.
So
the leg was amputated in a young child, and then the child survived and then lived some number of years.
For probably about 10 years. Yeah. And we published that also in Nature. That was a big discovery because it changes also the origin of like advanced medical knowledge, because it was thought that the first surgery was done in Western Europe, where there was I think the oldest one was 7,000 years ago, like agricultural society. There's more people living together. There's more knowledge being known about medicine. There's more disease and stuff. But now we show that a hunter-gatherer society living in Borneo in the rainforest had the medical knowledge to amputate. So they knew they had to amputate for the child to survive. We calculated that he would have bled out in 2 seconds. So they knew they had to stop the bleeding. They must have also like a lot of knowledge about medical plants, about like antiseptic, pain.
Yeah, because obviously there was no deadly infection that ensued, so they must have done something.
Well, exactly. They're in a rainforest. Right?
Yeah.
So they must have had a lot of knowledge about plant medicine, etc. And also like a community care. Also, they had to care for that person. So that was a really huge discovery. So,
and that was you said, how old was that one?
31,000.
31,000. Okay.
Yeah. So we know that at the time there was a group there that was making sophisticated rock art. They had advanced medical knowledge. They're the first people that actually went over the ocean by boat, so to pass the wireless line to go to those islands, and they arrived in Australia. Yeah. So there was a very sophisticated culture.
Yeah, and all of these things, it's very difficult to imagine such a culture existing without language.
Well, yeah, exactly. So they need to have language. They need to, and it's one of the things that I like about archaeology and about the past is you find one thing and it changes everything. Like you have like preconceived ideas about stuff and based on previous discoveries, and then you find and you date rock art that's on the opposite side of the world, and said, okay, so it was not invented in Europe. And then you said, okay, and now like you're showing that hunter-gatherer 30,000 years ago were capable of doing an amputation and child survive. And I said, oh, wow. So it changes everything about what we thought we knew about our past.
And so if this evidence of an amputation is 30,000 years old, and this evidence of the cave art in Sulawesi that you found is at least 50,000 years old, if it's true that these capabilities are even older, I would imagine, if I was just thinking about this and thinking about where to look, if people came out of Africa at some point, some turned west, some turned east. If you work backwards from Indonesia towards Africa, you might expect that those sites would be potential sites where even older cave art exists. Is that the way you think about it? Are you guys looking for older cave sites closer to Africa? How old do you think this stuff could be?
Yeah, there's a lot of rock art in Africa. There's a lot of rock art in India, for example. The problem is not many in limestone caves. So as I said, rock art is really difficult to date. So so that's the thing. So it may be essentially an artifact of that. So we either it's not preserved or it's not there at all, or it's there but we can't date it. So we're trying to develop new methods also for dating. So we're using uranium series dating on calcium carbonate deposits. We're trying to adapt that to different types of rock surface coatings that not necessarily formed in limestone. So I think one of the most promising one would probably one called amorphous silica skin. So that's formed in different types of geology, but sandstone, for example, there's a lot of rock art in sandstone, and sometimes you see those white film transparent that form on top of it. And I think we can probably date that with uranium series dating, but they're really thin. So with the laser ablation method now, we think it's probably going to work, but we're trying to develop. It's complicated, but without going into too much detail, we have to develop standards that we can use to do the dating. So we're working towards that at the moment. But hopefully in the future we'll be able to date rock art not just in limestone.
And so one thing I want to clarify, actually, so this narrative cave art that you found in Sulawesi is 51,000 years old or older. Is that the oldest narrative cave art, or is that the oldest cave art period?
Well, it's the oldest cave art period that's attributed to modern, that's been dated, that we know of, that's attributed to modern humans. But and then if I mention that, then we start dwelling into the big question is, did other species did rock art is art? So that's one of the big questions. I actually give a guest lecture at uni on that topic, but because there was a couple of sites in Spain a few years ago that was dated with uranium series dating to 65, 67,000 years old. And there's been a lot of controversy about that. There's lots of papers that are criticizing that. There's a paper with 20, 30 archaeologists, and they said that's wrong because people have been studying that site and those painting for a long time. Like, you cannot deny all that knowledge, But and we wrote a paper also criticizing that. We didn't criticize the dating method as such, the uranium series dating, but we criticized that because we're not dating the pigment itself, so we're dating what has formed on top of it. So the relationship between what you're dating and the pigment needs to be 100% clear. Like, you need to be 100% clear that what you're dating is actually 100% related to the pigment layer. And in Europe, in those caves, to my opinion, it wasn't that clear. And the reason is because they're not, as far as I understand, they're not allowed to take a sample through the pigment layer. So they actually use a scalpel, and they do like a sort of cone-shaped thing. So they scrape the coating like this, and they stop when they think they're just about to reach the pigment layer. They see a bit of red, and they stop there. And the problem with that is that you're not 100% sure that it's the pigment layer that's underneath it, because sometimes you have natural red, color that form on top of the painting. But also is that so those things, so it's also cave popcorn, like the deposits, and they form, it's hard to explain on the like this without having like a visual, but it's essentially small clusters that start really tiny. And then they join together and they form a bigger cluster, et cetera, et cetera. So you could have a little cluster that's tiny, like a few microns, that start on the cave wall, and then someone go there and do a painting, let's say a hand stencil next to it. And then that cluster grows, there's other cluster, and then they join together. And then eventually it's on top of the painting. So if you take that sample, but because they're taking essentially a cone, and let's say that what they're exposing in the middle is the pigment layer, it's possible that part of what they're taking on the side of it was there before the painting was made. So just a tiny bit of that mix into the rest of the sample will make it too old, right? So that's why you need to really make sure that 100% of all of the material that you use for dating is on top of the pigment layer. There cannot be any ambiguity about that. And there was ambiguity about the relationships between that. So that's my issue there. But I don't have any problem with the concept that Neanderthal could make rock art, and why not? But I think it hasn't been
it hasn't been definitively shown yet.
Yeah.
So with the narrative cave art that you found in Sulawesi, that's 51,000 years old or older, how do we know that was anatomically modern humans that made that? Were there any other subspecies of humans in that region at the same time, or do we think it was only anatomically modern humans that were present?
Well, that's the $1 million question. So we think it's probably modern human because we know that modern humans were there at the time. We know that modern humans have the capacity to do that, but we cannot be 100% sure. Like, we know there was other human species there also. There's the Denisovan who was around, which is another human species. Like, you have a Neanderthal and you have Denisovan. We know from modern DNA of people living in Papua and in Australia, like Aboriginal Australian and Papuans, that there's admixture between modern human and Denisovan in that region, but also the DNA data suggests that there could be also two other species, like ghost species, that we don't know anything about, that they're bred with.
So, and just for people to understand, when we say ghost species, basically geneticists can infer the presence of interbreeding with other species, even when we don't actually know the identity of those species yet.
Yeah, exactly. So there's genes that I said, okay, so that's not humans. So, and they don't match Neanderthals, they don't match Denisovan. So it suggests that it could have been two other human species that were there, like in the region at the time of the interbred modern human, could be as recently as 30,000 years ago. So yeah, it's quite interesting. We haven't found any evidence of those from the archaeology itself, but yeah, it's possible that some of the cave art is related to that. We can't be 100% sure. And we know there was other species also. So there's like Homo floresiensis, also the hobbit that you probably heard of, on Flores. I was involved in the dating of that also. So when they published that, I forgot the time, but it was quite a long time ago now. But they said, okay, they found a new human species. They call it Homo floresiensis. It was at the same time that the Lord of the Rings movies were out, so they called it the Hobbit. It had really short, really big feet. And then after that, they found more than one. So there's a lot of individual just in that cave. And what was also a very important discovery at the time is the dating, is that it suggests that it was 10,000 years old or something, like the younger specimen. But the bones themselves had never been directly dated. So Mike Morwood, who was one of the discoverers of that, he was at Wollongong University when I was there too. And they kept excavating there, and they realized that the stratigraphy was more complicated than what they thought. So because what they dated is they dated charcoal, in the layers in which the like remains are found, and they dating. I don't know if it was quartz or feldspar, but you can date crystals, like the last time they were exposed to sunlight, with a method called luminescence dating. And then they came back at about the same age. I think it was 10 or 12,000 years old or something like that. And then when they kept doing excavations, they did bigger and stuff, and they realized, the stratigraphy is really, really complicated. And so then Mark Moore would ask me, do you want to go and do U-series dating on the bones themselves? Because I've been working on that for a long time. It's complicated. It gives you like a minimum age. It's open system and stuff. But then he said, yeah, I can go and have a try. So I flew to Jakarta at the National Center for Archaeology. They opened the safe, and they were like the Hobbit remains are in. And then I cut pieces of, I think, nine, like different of the of bones of more than one. I think there's nine of them. And then I bring them back to Australia. I ran them in the lab, and they said, "Oh no, it's not 10,000 years old. It's at least 50,000."
Hmm.
And the stegodon, there's like pygmy elephant, they're at least 60,000. So it's probably about at least 60,000. So it means they probably got extinct when modern human arrived there. Yeah, they're not well, they didn't coexist with modern human for
For
like
very
40,
long.
50,000 for 40,000 years. So yes, so that changed the whole view on that at the time.
Hmm. What where are you looking in the world right now? Are you still working in the same sites in Indonesia? Are you working with samples from other sites?
Yeah, we're working still in Indonesia. So we're working in Sulawesi also. We've got lots of samples from there. We haven't run. We're working in Borneo also. We got new rock art samples that we got from there also from another the same area, but a different mountain that we never worked. That was too far, but it's already really remote there. Like in Sulawesi, it's easy. It's next to towns and people's farm and stuff. But in Borneo, you have to go for months, like in the jungle, and it's pretty remote. So we go up a river and there's a ridge, yeah, with caves, and that's been explored. But there's another mountain from another river further up. And it's called Tondoyan, and we've never been there. So we managed to go there, and we found rock art, but we just explored a little bit of it. So we want to go back and do some more exploration. But we haven't processed the samples yet, so I don't know the dates. Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you. But but we do have some old rock art also in Sulawesi. And we have rock art on the other side of Sulawesi, not just now because before it was just this southwest region. So we do have rock art now on the opposite side of Sulawesi that we've dated, and it's quite old. And so we're exploring further east also. So I'm going in about 3 weeks' time. I'm going to Misol Island. So it's a small island west of West Papua. So it's part of West Papua province of Indonesia, but it's an island. And then when the sea levels were lower, it was linked to Papua. So and Papua and Australia were linked together.
Mhm.
So if we can find some old rock out there, or I want to also find a good place to do an excavation next year, well, then we could have some really old rock art, or maybe on what's called Sahul, so the continent of Australia and New Guinea at lower sea level. So that's what we're missing at the moment. We have old rock art on mainland Asia, Wallacea, which is the islands in between, and now we're trying to get some on Sahul, like Australia,
Mhm.
Papua.
Mhm. When we take sort of a broad view of human evolution, I've talked to various paleoanthropologists on on the podcast before. It seems like the story of human evolution's been revised substantially, sort of over and over again. We keep discovering, these new species of humans, the Denisovans, the hobbits, a Homo naledi story out of South Africa. We keep discovering that, certain things like cave art, like the work that you've done, are, older and older than we used to think. Certain things are happening in different parts of the world that we thought were happening just in Europe, but they're happening in Indonesia even before that, et cetera, et cetera. What are some of the lessons that you've learned as an archaeologist and a paleo guy in this field about the story of human evolution and how attached we become to certain stories and how much we still have to learn?
Yeah, well, I think you have to be open-minded. That's the first thing. You need to acknowledge that what we know is based on a handful of pieces of evidence. So you just need one more pieces and it changes the whole lot. So and that's why it's interesting. And that's why it's interesting to do that, because you you go and look somewhere that people haven't looked before. You date stuff that people haven't dated before, and then you find new stuff, and then you say, okay, and then it changes everything. Why? Because what we know is only based on a handful of data. So yeah, it's interesting. Also, not just the dating, but the genetics now, we can find out. We talk about other species that were inbreeding with us. We got full genomes of Neanderthals. We know that Neanderthal and modern human mixed together, and Neanderthal and Denisovan and modern humans. We all mixed together at some stage in the past. So yeah, as the science evolve, also we're finding lots of data. So we're trying to piece this complex puzzle together, but we only have little pieces of it. So and sometimes you have to look in the right place. And I remember there's a guy, a scientist in Canada, Henry Schwartz. He wrote in one of his books, I think he says, Archaeology or the study of human evolution. It's like a drunken a person uh, that gets out of the pub at night and then he lost his key, but he's looking for his keys under the lampshade because the light is better there, right? But they're not there. So it's essentially what we're doing. So we're trying to break that mold and look somewhere else, but what we always tended to look where it's easy. Um,
One thing I want to ask you about, I don't know if you know about this or you have an opinion on this, but you've done a lot of work, archaeological work, that we discussed today, including uncovering burial sites. The really interesting one that we talked about just a few minutes ago, the story of Homo naledi in South Africa that's come out in recent years. I know that's a very provocative and interesting and controversial story. The claim is that they found evidence of burials that are, I think, a couple million years old in that species in South Africa. Do you think that's true? And whether or not you think that part of it's true, what are sort of the oldest burials that you are convinced of?
well, I don't think that's true. One thing. So I think that I mean, I don't want to get in trouble here or get sued or anything. So that to be what I say, but essentially so they found a new human species there. I think there's no doubt about it. It's a new human species. There've been some independent dating being done, but then the person that's in charge of that cave and those discoveries then has made a lot of claims recently that were not necessarily scientifically backed by like evidence, and it wasn't peer reviewed either. So there's an interest. So essentially the way we work is you have scientific questions that you need to have some questions that are answerable. So you can develop some tests to test those scientific questions, and then you find some answers to that. You write a paper, you send it for peer review, and then it's evaluated and it's accepted or rejected, or they want modification, etc. But then the groups that are working there, they claim that they found burial and also that Nadeli was making rock art there. And they wrote a paper about it in a journal, but that journal had changed their model where they didn't send the papers for peer review first. So they published the paper. And after that, they published the peer reviews with the comment, and then it was rejected. But at the time, it was already in the media. And the reason why they did that is because they had a Netflix movies that was coming out, right? So they did it like that. So I don't think it's a good way to do science. Like it's essentially like there's not enough evidence to say that it is or it is not. Well, I mean, I think it's not, but like in terms of the rock art there, like they found some markings on the wall there, but those caves have been visited for. It's not just Nadeli that has been in there. Like cavers have been in there for years. There was also mining in those caves, fires also in those caves. We know that miners at the beginning of the century were going in these caves and lighting fires, etc. That they haven't done any dating. Like it would be easy to take a piece of the charcoal and date it. They haven't done that. They're just saying, oh yeah, Nadeli did that. Did he? And the burial is the same, and stuff. So it's just like, I don't know. So there's a lot of,
I see.
yeah, and there's things like that, but there's a market for that. It's the same thing about I forgot the name of this show, like on Netflix, like, and now they're doing another series with Keanu Reeves. Like there's a market for that out there that people want to know stuff that's controversial, but it's not necessarily true, And there's a type of people like that, of personality that media like that because they're prepared to be out there and say stuff that makes stuff that's like it's controversial, but it's not necessarily true.
So, in what are the oldest examples of human burials that people agree on universally? How old are those?
I don't remember, but I think there was a site in Africa where my colleague at Griffith, Michael Petraglia, had excavated. I think it's that one, but I can't remember on the top of my head. But it's pretty old, like maybe like 100,000 or something. I can't really be sure, but yeah.
But anatomically modern humans have been doing that for quite a long time.
Yep.
Interesting. So what are some of the, I think we've already kind of touched on this, but what are some of the big questions that you and the people you're working with are asking right now? Are you simply looking for new evidence of older cave art? Are there other types of questions you're looking at that maybe are even unrelated to cave art?
Well, we're looking for not just older cave art, but any cave art that we can date. We're getting dates on this younger style of cave art also, like Austronesians, so people that arrived 4,000 years ago, and we can trace the movements of those people by the rock art also. So it's interesting. We can trace the movement also of all the modern human through the cave art, so we don't have to do full excavation, so we can date the rock art. So that's interesting. Looking to excavations also, we're always looking for. Yeah, but I mean, we were not looking for especially for like a burial in Borneo, but we found one. But if we can find old human burials, or even like like evidence of those ghost species that we found from the DNA, that would be amazing. But you need to be extremely lucky to find that. But we know they're out there somewhere. So it's a matter of getting out there and getting some funding and digging and exploring, and then eventually we'll find something interesting.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, so for this type of work, where does the funding typically come from? Is it mostly from the university system? And sort of how much funding is out there for this type of work? Because on the one hand, everyone pretty much is interested in the story of human evolution to some extent. People love learning about this stuff, even if they're not archaeologists or paleoanthropology people. But on the other hand, my understanding is that the funding is quite limited.
Yeah, the funding is quite limited. The only thing really you can apply for in Australia is the Australian Research Council, but that covers pretty much everything. There's another system for medical research that's separate, but for everything else, you have to go to the Australian Research Council. And yes, you need to have a good project. You have to have a good track record, but it's also a lottery. So the funding is limited. I always say if I was based in the United States or in Europe, I could get a lot more funding for the research that I do. But I'm based in Australia, and the research funding for that is less because it's a smaller pool of population. There's less money for research, but it's good that it's getting out there, like in the media, and like when we have big papers in Nature, then it brings the global attention to it. So it's always good, and that helps in the long term for the funding, because we're trying to find out who we are. It's interesting, and but there's also other aspect. Like diplomacy. Also, it opens a lot of door for the Australian government with the Indonesian government, etc. So there's all these aspects that we're trying to sell, to get more money. But I've got some grants from the National Geographic also before, but it used to be relatively small amount. I think they're bigger now, but it's limited, the amount of funding that's available for that type of research. That's for sure. And we would like to find out more about the conservation aspect of the rock art. As I was explaining, is disappearing. We would like to know what's going on. That sort of stuff. But it's up to get funding for that.
And so, I mean, just can you give me a sense for, so if I look at like this recent Nature paper, the narrative cave art in Indonesia, roughly speaking, off the top of your head, how many years of work does that represent, and how much money is that order of magnitude to do a project like that?
Well, it depends how you have to put that in context that we've already worked there before, establishing the like relationships and we've demonstrated that we can date the rock art there, etc. But I remember, like I said, I think like the project in Borneo that we did for just the dating of the rock art, not the excavation, that costs. And there was only one paper that we published in Nature for that, but it's really expensive to go there. Like we go like 20, 30 people in remote. We did 2 or 3 field season. It costs $500,000 Australian dollars for that. So that paper costs like $500,000 Australian dollars.
So like if some billionaire enthusiast of human evolution decided to just grant $10 million to a few different groups, that would do a lot. That would do a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But there are some people, philanthropists, that are giving money, but it's mainly like in United States or Europe and stuff. In Australia, it's really hard to get that kind of money available. Like people with that kind of money that were prepared to do that. Like it's hard to yeah. But by making new making movies and making podcasts and papers and stuff, maybe that's going to help. But yeah.
This has been fascinating. I just discovered your work pretty recently, but it was really cool to look at some of these recent papers. Is there anything that you want to reiterate that we talked about today, or any final thoughts you want to leave people with about your research or about this field of study in general?
I don't know. Well, it's still ongoing, so we're still working there. So the project that I have at the moment, so it's funded by the Australian Research Council, where we're not just looking at the rock art, so we're looking at the northern route to Australia. So there's different. So when people arrived in Southeast Asia, when they want to reach Australia, Sahu, which is New Guinea, and Australia joined together, there's different modeling that has been done to show, because there's two arcs of islands in Indonesia. You can go to the northern island chain or the southern arc. So the northern one, you go to Borneo, Sulawesi, and then there's a series of islands, and then you end up in Papua. Then from there, you can walk, all the way to Australia. Or the southern route, which is Sumatra, Java, the Bali, Lombok, and then you probably end up in Timor. Then from Timor, then you have to go by boat to Australia, to the Kimberley. And there's been different papers over the years, like modeling, like they're looking at sea level heights and what you can see, the next island. And they suggest that it's probably the northern route that the earliest human have used, but there's no evidence of human there at the time. But now with the rock art, we can piece that together. And now the oldest one that we have is 51.2 minimum, but we have some coming hopefully next year that's going to show that it's older than that. But all of the rock art that we've dated so far, like the places in rock art, it's all in the northern island chain of Indonesia. So it's interesting. You got like islands like Java, for example, where there's limestone cave everywhere. There's millions of people live there, and there's no rock art site at all. So there seemed to be a relationship between the first wave of modern human that reached Australia and in cave art. So I've got a project on that. So we're looking at the northern route. So not just dating the rock art, but so a part of it was to develop this laser ablation method that we just showed that it's working, but also to doing excavation. So we did an excavation in Borneo. Now we're looking for a place to do an excavation in Misol Island, as I mentioned. We're working in Sulawesi, also excavation there. So yeah, so we got this project. It's a 5-year project. Looking at that modern human through the northern route.
Well, this has been fascinating. Thanks for taking the time, especially with the difference in time zone here, Australia versus the US. It sounds like in the next year or two, you're going to have more work coming out. That sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, we will.
Right,
yeah,
so
we got a couple of big things coming out. Maybe one before the end of the year. I'm not sure. It depends on the acceptance, but the next year there'll be some big papers coming out soon.
All right. Well, I'll keep my eye out for that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Yeah. Thanks to you.